How do you know you're voting for the political party that's good for prosperity? The wrong vote leads to stock market bubbles where retirement savings can disappear in a crisis, where most of the wealth the economy creates goes to the very top, and workers get a smaller share of a slower growing pie. The right vote leads to a rising economic tide that lifts everyone. Corporate-owned media would have you believe Republican policy brings prosperity, but you can't know this is true unless you have tracked changes of political control in Washington and the growth that followed. In the last 100 years, the Republican Party has had the president, the House, and the Senate before and after a presidential election 3 times. They did this in presidential elections in 1924, 28, and 2004. In the 5 years after these elections, growth was 3.4%, minus 4.8%, and 1.1%. The last 2 5-year periods took us to the bottom of the Great Depression and Great Recession. Democrats held the president, House, and Senate before and after presidential elections in 1936, 40, 44, and 64. The following 5 years grew at 7.1%, 11.9%, minus 2.2%, and 4.8%. 5-year periods following Republican domination averaged growing at minus 0.1%. Growth following Democratic power averaged growing at 5.4%. It's easy to get the data so you can confirm this. You can Google party divisions in Congress. The first item should be from Wikipedia. This has all the data from the first election to the last one. For the Senate and the House, it shows how many seats the 2 main parties had. This is data you can copy and paste into a spreadsheet. To get the annual economic data, you can Google GDPCA. The first search result should be the St. Louis Federal Economic Database entry, or FRED. The economy is measured by real gross domestic product, or GDP, which is the total quantity of new goods and services produced in a year by labor, property, and entrepreneurial zeal in the United States. It's the pie we get to divide to satisfy the needs and wants of everyone in the country. After you pull up the page, you can download the data into a spreadsheet. This goes back to 1929. To get data prior to 29, go to measuringworth.com. When you get there, click the GDP dataset. It has estimates for the economy all the way back to 1790 when the first census was taken. Actually, you could download all the data from Measuring Worth. I showed you both because you might trust the recent data more from an official source. Before strengthening the case that Republican politics harms growth, let's be sure we understand, as individuals, Republicans make fine business people and dedicated workers who are vital to prosperity. If you are to believe Republican politics is bad for growth, you will have to come up with a reason. Perhaps these could be your starting point. Republicans like business. When in power, they pursue policy to boost profits. Often, protections for workers and consumers are weakened, which messes up the purpose of a market economy. Profit is supposed to direct talent and resources to businesses and industries that are doing the best job of satisfying the needs and wants of people. If protections are weak, profit-seeking diverts talent and resources to businesses that take advantage of people with low pay, price gouging, lax worker safety, deceptive marketing, and so on. This slows the economic growth after a few years and makes life tougher for most people. Democrats favor policy that protect workers and consumers, so profit-seeking does a better job of directing resources to businesses that take care of people and grow the economy. Also, Republican tax policies may encourage wealthy business owners to pull more revenue out of businesses as personal income, leaving less money within businesses for wages, research, equipment, and other expenditures that grow the economy. You can see the data for this in the Wage Wars video on the John Early YouTube channel. If you take a more detailed look at the data, you will probably find this pattern. When the economy is strong, Republicans usually gain political power. perhaps because corporations have more money to bankroll profit-friendly Republicans. After a few years in power, the economy weakens, and Democrats usually gain seats in Congress, perhaps because corporations have less money to back Republicans. After a few years of Democratic control, the economy strengthens and the cycle continues. Using the data you now know how to download, here is my chart of the House and Senate back to 1880. With this, you can calculate the percentage of Republicans in each chamber and then average those two to get the political control of Congress. And here's the Democratic share. I've looked at the relationship between political control of Congress and growth in over 2,000 ways. I'll show you enough to understand what I'm doing, plus a few highlights. You can confirm the analysis or do something completely new. Here's a chart of GDP from 1990. You can calculate the percentage change between each data point to get a one-year rate of growth. We could calculate the growth rate between these 2 points and get a 5-year rate of growth, which looks like this. The scale shows the rate of GDP growth over 5-year periods. It's ranged from 0.7 to 4.3%. The last point shows the 2.4% rate for the 5 years 2015 through 2019. The one-year rate of growth got down to minus 2.5% in the Great Recession. Since the financial crisis, the best growth came in 2015 and 2018. Now we can add the Republican percentage of Congress for each of these years. It looks like there is a correlation where more Republicans correspond with stronger growth. To get a clearer sense, we can add a scatter plot. Each point on the scatter plot corresponds with a pair of points on the line chart and shows a growth rate and a percent of Republicans in Congress for a given year. The scatter plot shows the same data as the lines. The mathematically calculated best fit line through the data slopes upward, showing that more Republicans correspond with faster growth. We can adjust this scale to the best fit line. Now the range of the line for Republicans in Congress matches the range of the best fit line. R, the correlation coefficient, is 0.37 for this fit. If it were 1, it wouldn't be a scatter plot. All the points would be on the upward sloping line. If it were -1, they'd all be on a downward sloping line. If it were 0, there would be a random cloud of dots. The R squared of 0.14 suggests the share of Republicans influences 14% of the variations in growth, or vice versa, that growth influences how many Republicans. Measuring the strength of a relationship and how we're about to use the measures to show how long one thing takes to have its biggest influence on another may seem confusing, but enough examples are coming that you will get it. Earlier, you heard me claim a strong economy helps elect Republicans. This becomes clearer when we shift the timescale for Republicans back a year. Now the Republican timescale begins in 1991 instead of 90. It lags a year. The chart labels this as a lead time of -1. This point on the scatter plot now corresponds with the growth rate in 1999 and the share of Republicans in 2000. You have now seen two lead times, 0 and -1. I've calculated R for 30 lead times. I'll add one more graph to show you. The calculations go from a lead time of -7 years to 23 years. The red dot shows the 0.55 correlation at a -1 year lead time. The pinkish line shows the value of R for all 30 lead times. 0.55 is the strongest of the 30. The R squared suggests 30% of the changes in the Republican control of Congress is explained by the economic growth rate the year before. Let's run through examples of growth during election years and the share of Republicans serving in Congress the year after the election. Stronger growth in 1994 meant more Republicans were elected and took office in 95. Slightly weaker growth in 2000 left fewer Republicans in 2001. Growth strengthened in 2002 and 2004, followed by more Republicans in 2003 and 2005. Growth faltered in 2006 and 2008. Republicans lost ground in 2007 and 2009. Recovering growth in 2010 led to a Republican resurgence in 2011. Stronger growth in 2014 helped give Republicans their largest share of Congress in 74 years in 2015. Strong growth in years prior to an election appear to help Republicans, but the correlation is not as strong. A -2-year lead time has a weaker correlation. It gets weaker at -3. Now let's move the other way, back to -2, -1, 0, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. At 3 years, the correlation turns negative. R is -0.17. The best fit line slopes slightly down. The Republican scale has inverted. The small percentage is on top and the big percentage is on the bottom. More Republicans now correspond with weaker growth. The negative correlation gets stronger at 4 years and peaks at a 5-year lead time. In 2015 and 2016, Republicans held the largest share of Congress since 1930. The correlation suggests growth in 2020 and 2021 will be 1.3%. If we switch and look at Democrats in Congress, the low ratio of Democrats in 2015 and 2016 also suggests weak growth in 2020. Democrats currently hold 49.5% of Congress, which implies growth of 2.2% in 2024 and 25. If we could turn 60% of Congress to Democrats in the 2020 election, it would imply growth of 3.6% starting in 2026. The positive relationship between growth and Democrats remains somewhat meaningful out through a 10-year lead time, but becomes insignificant after that. Earlier, I showed you a 5-year growth rate. Here it is again. Before looking at the 5-year average of Republicans in Congress, let's look at the graph of R. Republicans have their strongest positive correlation with a -1-year lead time. The strongest negative correlation is with a 7-year lead time. We'll look at all of these. In the -1-year lead time, the 5-year growth rate of 2.5% from 2014 through 2018 lines up with the 53.3% Republicans averaged in Congress from 2015 through 2019. It's this point on the scatter plot. The relationship between Republicans and growth in both 1- and 5-year periods backs up this turn in the cycle that strong growth helps get Republicans elected. It also backs up this turn that weak growth means fewer Republicans and more Democrats get elected. Now we'll look at more lead times. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. With the 7-year lead time, the 53.4% of Republicans in 2014 through 2018 gives a growth estimate of 1.3% for the 5-year period 2021 through 2025. The relationship between growth and Republicans using 1- and 5-year periods both show more Republicans in power lead to weaker growth after a few years. We have now looked at the relationship between growth and Republicans in Congress for 1- and 5-year periods. I've looked at relationships for all the growth periods from 1 to 23 years at all the lead times from -7 to 23. That's 690 charts. Out of these 690, we've already seen the strongest positive correlation between growth and Republicans. It was the 1-year period with the -1-year lead time. The strongest positive correlation for Democrats is with 8-year periods and an 8-year lead time. The relationship suggests that 89% of the change in the growth rate of 8-year periods is influenced by the average share of Democrats in Congress during the previous 8 years. The strongest growth was the 8 years from 1983 to 1990, growing at 4.1%, and was influenced by Democrats averaging 59.9% of Congress for the years 75 to 82. The worst 8-year period so far, 2007 through 2014, growing at 1.2%, was influenced by Democrats only averaging 47.2% of Congress for the years 99 through 2006. Democrats held slightly fewer seats in this 8-year period, which implies 2019 through 2026 will grow at 1.4%. If we could elect Democrats to 60% of the seats in Congress and maintain that percentage for 8 years, we should be able to have an 8-year growth rate around 4.1%. The relationship between Democrats and growth for 1, 5, and 8-year periods all show that more Democrats in power leads to stronger growth in 5 to 8 years. In addition to the period from 1990 to 2019, I also ran the 690 calculations for the period 1950 to 2019 and 1920 to 2019. The strongest positive correlation for Republicans in the 50 to 2019 period was with 21-year periods of growth and a 23-year lead time. While the R-squared is strong, this is probably an example of correlation not being the result of causation or influence. The strength of the correlation is in the first 43 years. It may just be a coincidence that the share of Republicans and the 21-year growth rate had a major downtrend 23 years apart. In the last 25 years, the lines move in opposite directions. The strongest correlation for 21-year periods was negative with a 3-year lead time. The fit for the last 11 years is almost perfect. The 21-year growth rate falling to its lowest level since the Great Depression corresponds with Republicans averaging their highest 21-year share of Congress since 1932. The strongest Democratic relationship to growth for the 50 to 2019 period is with 17-year periods and a 3-year lead time. The R2 suggests almost half the variation of growth for 17-year periods comes from changes in Democrats' share of Congress. The relationship implies if we could return 60% of Congress to Democrats in 2020, we could start a 17-year period that would grow at 4.1% as early as 2024. In the 1920 to 2019 timeframe, the strongest positive correlation for Republicans uses 6-year periods with a minus 7-year lead time. This could add to the case of strong growth helping elect Republicans. Using 6-year periods, Republicans appear to be bad for growth from a 0-year lead time out to a 10-year lead time. The correlation using a 15-year lead time is almost as strong as with the minus 7-year lead time, but an R-squared of only 0.07 is not impressive. The relationship has overestimated the 6-year rate of growth for 17 straight years. The strongest correlation is with the 3-year lead time. It's negative, so more Republicans means weaker growth. In the first half of the data, the highs and lows in the two lines match up better than in the second half. It appears sometime in the 1970s or 80s, the lead time shifted from here out to a 7-year lead time. The relationship implies that getting Republicans down to 40% of Congress would boost the growth rate to 4.3%. The best positive correlation for Democrats comes with 15-year periods and a 3-year lead time. Let's take a look at the big picture. The worst growth in the history of the nation roughly coincides with Democrats having the smallest share of Congress in the last 100 years. The best growth ever came with the largest share of Democrats in Congress. Growth weakened when Democrats lost influence, then strengthened with more Democrats. The smallest share of Democrats since the Depression has been followed by the 15-year growth rate pushing the lowest levels since the 1930s. You've had a lot of data dumped on you. To fulfill your role of protecting yourself, your assets, your family, and the nation, you're going to have to trust yourself to understand the data. Will you confirm that growth tends to weaken 3 to 8 years after Republicans gain power and strengthens 3 to 8 years after Democrats gain power? Can you refute that history suggests Democrats holding 60% of Congress should push the growth rate above 4%? It appears we are at the point in the cycle where we should vote for Democrats to create prosperity for all. To see updates on these charts and get other important economic and financial information, subscribe to this YouTube channel and please share this with your friends.